Something unusual is happening in the tech world right now, and if you're paying close attention, you can almost feel it. The biggest companies on the planet, the ones that control operating systems, cloud platforms, mobile ecosystems, and even the hardware in your pocket, are watching something very closely. They're not watching each other. They're watching Linux. Yes, the same open source operating system that many people still think is just for programmers, hackers, or server rooms. The same Linux that quietly powered the internet for decades without demanding attention. But today, Linux is no longer quiet. It's evolving, expanding, and slowly positioning itself in places big tech once considered permanently locked down. And that is exactly why some of the largest corporations in the world are nervous right now. For years, companies like Microsoft and Apple built their dominance on control. Control of software distribution, control of updates, control of hardware integration, control of developer ecosystems. That control created enormous revenue streams. When you own the operating system, you shape the rules. You decide which apps are allowed, how they're distributed, how they're monetized, and how deeply they integrate into the system. But Linux operates on a completely different philosophy. It isn't owned by a single corporation. Its core is stewarded by the Linux Foundation and guided by figures like Linus Torvalds, but the code itself is open to the world. Anyone can inspect it, modify it, redistribute it, and build something new on top of it. That openness isn't just ideological, it's strategic. And it's becoming powerful in ways that weren't obvious a decade ago. Look at the servers that power the internet. The majority of them run Linux. Cloud infrastructure from Amazon, Google, and Microsoft heavily relies on Linux. Android, which dominates the smartphone market globally, is built on the Linux kernel. Even supercomputers, the machines that model climate change and simulate complex physics, overwhelmingly run Linux. For a long time, that dominance stayed in the background. Consumers didn't care what powered the backend of websites. They cared about Windows laptops and MacBooks. They cared about iPhones and apps. But something changed when computing started shifting away from traditional desktops toward cloud-first, web-based, and containerized environments. Suddenly, Linux wasn't just the backend. It became the foundation of everything modern computing depends on. Big tech companies understand this shift very well. They know that if developers become comfortable building, deploying, and scaling applications on Linux-based systems, the importance of proprietary desktop platforms starts to shrink. If your entire workflow runs in a browser, on a Linux server, accessed through a web app, the underlying operating system on your personal machine matters less. That reduces lock-in. And lock-in is one of the most valuable assets big tech has ever had. When customers are locked into ecosystems, switching becomes expensive, inconvenient, and risky. Linux weakens that lock-in by offering an alternative that is free, transparent, and increasingly user-friendly. Over the last few years, desktop Linux distributions have matured dramatically. Projects like Ubuntu, Fedora, and Linux Mint have made installation simple, hardware support stronger, and user interfaces more polished. Gaming, once considered impossible on Linux, has improved massively due to Proton and compatibility layers that allow Windows games to run with minimal friction. Developers who once kept a Windows machine solely for gaming now find they don't need to. That might seem like a small cultural shift, but culture drives adoption. When tech-savvy users migrate, others follow. And big tech notices these patterns long before mainstream headlines do. Another reason for the nervousness lies in sovereignty and control at a national level. Governments around the world are increasingly wary of relying on foreign corporations for critical digital infrastructure. Open-source software like Linux offers transparency and independence. Countries can audit the code, adapt it to their needs, and avoid dependency on a single vendor. This reduces geopolitical leverage that proprietary software companies might indirectly hold. When governments shift toward Linux-based systems in education, administration, or defense, it signals something bigger than a hobbyist movement. It signals strategic diversification away from centralized corporate control. Artificial intelligence has also amplified Linux's influence. Most AI research, training environments, and production systems run on Linux. Machine learning frameworks are optimized for it. GPU drivers and compute stacks are deeply integrated into Linux environments. If AI becomes the defining technology of the next decade, and Linux is the primary operating system powering it, that gives Linux enormous strategic weight. It means innovation pipelines increasingly depend on open infrastructure rather than proprietary consumer platforms. And that changes who holds the real power in the tech ecosystem. There's also the matter of developer loyalty. Developers shape the future of software. When new programmers learn coding today, they often learn in Linux-based environments, whether directly or through cloud containers. They grow comfortable with command lines, package managers, and open tooling. They contribute to GitHub repositories, collaborate on open projects, and build with cross-platform technologies. If a generation of developers grows up viewing Linux as the default development environment, the cultural center of gravity shifts. Big tech can't easily control that shift because it's decentralized by nature. At the same time, privacy concerns have grown globally. Users are more aware than ever of telemetry, data collection, and surveillance capitalism. Proprietary operating systems often include background services that users can't fully inspect or disable. Linux distributions, by contrast, allow full transparency. If you want to audit what's running on your system, you can. If you want to remove a component, you can. That transparency appeals to privacy advocates, journalists, activists, and security professionals. As public awareness of digital privacy increases, open-source systems gain moral and practical credibility. Big tech's nervousness doesn't necessarily mean panic. Many large corporations actually contribute to Linux development. Microsoft, once famously hostile to Linux, now supports it heavily within Azure and even provides Windows subsystem for Linux. But that support can also be interpreted as strategic adaptation. When a movement becomes too strong to crush, you integrate with it, you participate. You attempt to influence its direction while ensuring your own services remain essential. Supporting Linux in the cloud allows companies to benefit from its dominance while still monetizing surrounding infrastructure. Yet the core threat remains. Linux reduces dependency. It empowers users to build their own systems, control their own updates, and shape their own computing experience. It encouraged modularity over centralization. And modular systems are harder to monopolize. Big tech thrives on ecosystems where hardware, software, services, and app stores reinforce each other. Linux thrives on interoperability and standards. It doesn't demand that you stay within one company's walls. It invites you to remix and redistribute. There's also the rise of alternative hardware ecosystems. Companies building ARM-based systems, single-board computers, and custom embedded devices often choose Linux because of its flexibility. As hardware becomes more diverse, Linux becomes the glue that unifies it. That undermines the assumption that mainstream consumer computing must revolve around a handful of proprietary operating systems. When innovation happens at the edges, in startups and research labs, Linux is often the default choice. Another dimension is cost. Licensing fees for proprietary operating systems can be significant at scale. Enterprises running thousands of machines look closely at total cost of ownership. Linux, being free to use and modify, presents an attractive economic argument. Support contracts and enterprise distributions exist, but they compete in a marketplace rather than enforcing a single mandatory license model. In economic downturns or uncertain markets, cost efficiency becomes even more critical. And Linux often wins that comparison. Education is quietly shaping the next decade as well. Schools and universities teaching computer science frequently rely on Linux environments. Students learn system administration, networking, and programming in open-source contexts. When those students enter the workforce, they bring those skills and preferences with them. If Linux becomes the standard learning environment, it gradually becomes the standard professional environment. The open-source model also fosters rapid innovation. Thousands of contributors worldwide can identify bugs, propose improvements, and experiment with new ideas. This distributed development model can outpace centralized corporate roadmaps in certain areas. When innovation emerges from a global community rather than a single boardroom, it can be unpredictable and disruptive. Big tech companies must constantly monitor these developments because they can't fully control them. Containerization technologies like Docker and orchestration systems like Kubernetes, which themselves are rooted in Linux concepts, further solidify Linux's role as the backbone of modern infrastructure. Applications are increasingly packaged in ways that abstract away the host operating system, but that abstraction layer often assumes Linux underneath. As more software is deployed in containers, Linux becomes the invisible standard. Some might argue that Linux has always been strong in servers and that nothing has fundamentally changed. But what has changed is visibility and usability. User interfaces have improved, hardware compatibility has expanded. Gaming support has grown, creative software alternatives have matured. The barrier to entry is lower than ever. When barriers drop, adoption can accelerate in non-linear ways. Big Tech's concern is not that Linux will suddenly replace every Windows PC or every Mac overnight. The concern is more subtle. It's about gradual erosion of dependency. It's about a world where operating systems become interchangeable commodities and value shifts toward services and platforms. If the OS layer loses its grip, pricing power shifts. Strategic leverage shifts. Control shifts. Open source also aligns with broader cultural trends favoring decentralization. From blockchain experiments to federated social networks, there's a growing appetite for systems not controlled by a single authority. Linux fits naturally into that narrative. It represents digital self-determination. Even if most users never compile a kernel or submit a patch, the mere existence of that freedom influences perception. And perception matters in markets. When consumers believe they have alternatives, dominant players lose some negotiating power. Even if Linux remains a minority on consumer desktops, its presence acts as competitive pressure. It pushes proprietary systems to improve, to reduce overtly unpopular practices, and to justify their value propositions more clearly. Security is another complex factor. Open source code can be audited publicly, which can increase trust. Vulnerabilities are often discovered and patched rapidly by global contributors. While no system is immune to flaws, transparency can build resilience. In contrast, closed systems require trust in the vendor's internal processes. As cybersecurity becomes more critical globally, transparent systems gain appeal. At the enterprise level, hybrid cloud strategies often rely on Linux to ensure portability across providers. Organizations don't want to be locked into a single vendor stack. Linux enables flexibility. That flexibility reduces dependence on any one cloud provider, even those who heavily support Linux themselves. So when we say Big Tech is nervous about Linux, it's not about fear of immediate collapse. It's about long-term structural change. It's about a technology that underpins nearly everything, is free from single company ownership, and continues to evolve in user-friendly directions. It's about developers choosing open tools by default. It's about governments seeking independence. It's about AI running on open foundations. It's about gamers discovering they don't need proprietary platforms as much as they once did. Linux represents a shift from centralized control to collaborative infrastructure. It challenges the traditional power dynamics of the tech industry not by attacking them directly, but by quietly building alternatives. It doesn't need flashy marketing campaigns. It grows through communities, forums, code repositories, and word of mouth. That kind of growth is difficult to suppress because it's distributed. In the end, the open source threat isn't about destruction. It's about transformation. Big tech companies may continue to thrive, but they must adapt to a world where control over the operating system layer is no longer absolute. They must compete on services, integration, and innovation rather than relying solely on ecosystem lock-in. Linux is a reminder that software can belong to everyone and no one at the same time. And in an industry built on control, that idea alone is powerful enough to make even the biggest corporations just a little bit nervous.